Hi, I'm Bill Arnold. Thank you for listening to this podcast. There are many more podcasts available at myfaithradio.com. Your support makes this possible. Thank you.
Psalm 111 verse 4 says, "He has caused his wonders to be remembered. The Lord is compassionate and gracious." My guest today in studio are Dr. Brad Sickler. He's the department head of the Biblical and Theological Studies and professor of philosophy. Brian DeVries is with us as well. He's the area director for Search Ministries, Minnesota. And our very special guest, the always great, never less than sensational, Dr. Stephen Meyer. Who got his PhD in philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge and author of the New York Times best-selling book, Darwin's Doubt and Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 scientific discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here, Bill. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Let me start with you, Stephen. What was life like growing up? Like in high school, did you go to prom or did you stay home and study that night too?
Oh, I didn't study, but I didn't get to go to prom because I couldn't find a girl who would go with me. I was too geeky. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you about your fantastic book, Return of the God Hypothesis. Let me start, and just maybe you would be kind enough to just give us the overarching premise of this book.
Yeah, that's great. The book tells a story, and it's the story of the influence of Judeo-Christian ideas, theistic ideas, biblical ideas on the rise of modern science during a period of time called the Scientific Revolution from roughly 1500 to 1750. And then it also tells how those ideas kind of went into abeyance, or there was an eclipse of those ideas during the 19th century with the rise of ideas like Darwin's theory of evolution, Marx's theory of dialectical materialism, and later Freudian ideas about the human condition. So by the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, science was seen to support a kind of what scholars call a materialistic worldview that denied the role of an intelligent agent or creator of any kind, and thus departing from the Judeo-Christian or theistic foundation of modern science. And in the book, I argue that theistic perspective is now coming back, or should be coming back, because of 3 great discoveries that have been made about the origin of the universe, about the fine-tuning of the physical parameters of the universe, and about the complexity of life, especially the informational complexity, the discovery of digital code in the DNA molecule, and the role that information plays in a complex information processing system for building the miniature machines that we're finding in cells. So it's a new day in science. We have the evidence of a creation event at the beginning of the universe, evidence for design of the universe from the very beginning, and what physicists call the fine-tuning of the basic parameters of physics. And then in life, this exquisite informational and nanotechnology that's been discovered inside even the simplest living cells, suggesting, as I argue in my books, the role or importance of designing intelligence and explaining the origin of life.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, when you talk about intelligent design, is that creationism? Or is it not creationism?
Well, it all depends on how people define terms, but typically creationism is based on the biblical text in Genesis 1, and the term is often associated with people who read the Genesis text in a particular way to affirm that the earth is very young. The theory of intelligent design is not based on biblical or scriptural text. Rather, it's an inference from biological and cosmological or physical evidence, and therefore it has a scientific basis rather than a theological basis. And moreover, most of the proponents of intelligent design know that, though not all, affirm that the universe and the earth are very old. More to the point, it's an age-neutral theory. It's really not addressing the question of how old is the earth, how long are the days of Genesis. It's really addressing the question of whether or not we see evidence of actual design in living organisms in the universe, rather than just the appearance or illusion of design, which is what Darwinists have long affirmed, they want to say life looks as though it was designed for a purpose, but that appearance is just an illusion. So we framed our ideas about intelligent design mainly in opposition to that key Darwinian claim that life is the product of undirected, unguided material processes. Richard Dawkins has famously said that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of design, but are not in fact designed. So we want to say, no, that appearance is not an illusion. It's real. There is evidence of actual design in life and also evidence of design in the universe.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Stephen Meyer is our guest. His book is Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 Scientific Discoveries that Reveal the Mind Behind the Universe. Now, Stephen, when we do evangelism, we'll have pushback from people that'll say, well, I'm more of a science guy. So I really can't believe in God. So I believe in science. So does science point to atheism?
Well, I definitely don't think so. There's a wonderful quotation from the leading scientific atheist in the world, Richard Dawkins. He says that the universe we observe has precisely the properties we observe. If at bottom there's no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. But wow. Blind, pitiless indifference for him is a poetic way of describing purely materialistic or purely undirected material processes. So Dawkins thinks that the properties of the universe support what scholars call a materialistic worldview or a scientific materialistic worldview. And I love the quote because it frames the issue so beautifully. The question is, Dawkins implies that if we look at the properties of the universe, we ought to be able to tell whether the universe is a product of blind, pitiless indifference, i.e. materialistic processes, or whether there might be a creator. He sides in the end with the idea that the properties of the universe suggest no creator, nothing but blind material processes. But in fact, the great discoveries of the last century, first in cosmology, the discovery that the universe, the physical universe of matter, space, time, and energy had a definite beginning as best we can tell. And secondly, the discovery that from the very beginning of the universe, the basic properties of physics, the strength of the physical forces, the mass of the elementary particles, the rate of the expansion of the universe, these various properties fall within these incredibly improbable sweet spots that make life possible. We call that the fine-tuning of the universe. And thirdly, the evidence of the complexity of living systems, the information and nanotechnology that we're finding in cells. Each one of these 3 big discoveries, which bear on the question of biological and cosmological origins, are completely unexpected from a materialistic point of view, and they're also unexplained from a materialistic point of view. So though Dawkins frames the argument beautifully, I think the evidence actually is contrary to his perspective, that the evidence we have is very unexpected from the standpoint of scientific materialism that holds that the universe the physical universe is eternal and self-existent and therefore does not need an external creator. And it also holds that there's no evidence of the activity of a designing mind in the history of the cosmos or life. But when we find digital code and complex information processing systems and tiny little miniature machines and cells, these are things that really shocked the scientific materialists when the cosmologists discovered that the physical universe had a definite beginning, a beginning to matter, space, time, and energy. That also shocked them because if matter itself has a beginning some finite time ago, before that, there is no matter to do the causing, and so there's no possibility of a materialistic explanation for the origin of matter itself. So the discoveries of the last 100 years have been decidedly contrary to materialistic expectations, and therefore don't support a materialistic worldview, but do support a contrary theistic worldview, and that's been the argument in my book. I call that the return of the God hypothesis.
No, so interesting. Dr. Stephen Meyer is my guest. I know that Brad and Brian are chomping to get into this conversation. Brad, I know you got something to ask Stephen.
Well, there's a lot that he just touched on, of course. We could talk for days. One of the things that I would like to hear your perspective on is, you mentioned the fine-tuning and the pushback or the response to that led to kind of the multiverse hypothesis. I was wondering what your thoughts were about that.
Oh, I love to talk about the multiverse. It's become a cultural icon. It's in all the Marvel
movies,
films and everything else.
Right.
So, the basic idea of the fine tuning, just to review, is that there are multiple parameters of the universe, the strength of gravitation or electromagnetism or the other fundamental forces of physics, or the force of the what's called the cosmological constant, the force that physicists have postulated to explain the expansion of the universe, the masses of the elementary particles, the quarks, the electrons, etc. All of these different parameters turn out to fall within very narrow ranges or tolerances outside of which life would be impossible in the universe. In fact, for many of these parameters, even basic chemistry would be impossible unless the universe exhibited parameters or values for the parameters that fell within these narrow ranges. And so physicists talk about them as the physical features of the universe as falling within these kinds of sweet spots. And some have even called our universe a Goldilocks universe. The fundamental forces are not too strong, not too weak. The rate of expansion of the universe is not too fast, not too slow. The masses of the elementary particles are not too heavy, not too light. And the odds of getting all these parameters just right is infinitesimally small because many of these parameters are independent of each other, and the odds of the physical attribute of the universe or property falling within that sweet spot is incredibly small. So, in virtue of that, some of the scientists who first discovered these, in particular Sir Fred Hoyle, who was a staunch scientific atheist, after discovering some of these fine-tuning parameters, reversed his worldview and affirmed a kind of basic or a kind of rudimentary theism, and said that he was quoted as saying that the fine-tuning, the best data we have, meaning about the fine-tuning, suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics to make life possible. So that's a kind of a design argument that he ended up making. And in response to that, many secular physicists now have proposed something called the multiverse. And that's the idea that even though getting all the parameters just right looks incredibly improbable, if there are enough other universes out there, it would be inevitable that in one of those universes, or maybe more, the right combination of parameters would end up arising, and therefore someplace, not everywhere, but someplace, life must arise inevitably. And we just happen to be in that lucky universe. And so that's been the secular explanation for the fine-tuning. There's a gabillion other universes out there, and eventually in one of them the right combination of parameters would have had to arise, and we just happen to be in that universe. But that explanation is actually problematic for reasons that are not often recognized. But and here's the basic problem. If you have all these other universes, rather, just having all these other universes doesn't solve the problem of the origin of the fine-tuning or explain the improbable fine-tuning, because if the other universes are out, if you have other universes out there and they're causally disconnected from our own universe, which is what we mean by a universe, it's a separate causally enclosed system, then just the existence of other universes has no effect on anything that happens in our universe, because there's no contact between the two. There's no causal connection. And that also applies to whatever process might have produced the fine-tuning in the first place. Just the existence of other universes doesn't explain why the parameters were set just the way they were, because those other universes have no effect on anything going on in this universe. So in virtue of that, the multiverse advocates have posited what are called universe-generating mechanisms, one based on something called inflationary cosmology, another based on something called string theory, both of which are kind of speculative cosmological models. But it turns out that when you examine these models carefully, that for these universe-generating mechanisms to produce other universes, even in theory, they themselves require prior exquisite and unexplained fine-tuning. And so you're right back to where you started. You have fine-tuning, you invoke universe-generating mechanisms, but the mechanisms themselves require fine-tuning. And so you still need to explain the ultimate origin of the fine-tuning of the universe-generating mechanisms. And since we know in our experience that finely tuned systems, whether we're talking about something like a Swiss watch or a French recipe or an internal combustion engine, all systems that we would describe as being finely tuned, by which we mean a system with multiple independent parameters that work together to accomplish some function where the parameters are extremely improbable. All such finely tuned systems arise from intelligent agents. So since the multiverse has not explained the ultimate origin of fine-tuning, even if it's true, it also suggests the need for intelligent design. So I think we really haven't gotten around that. The common sense interpretation that Fred Hoyle referred to is still the best explanation, and that is super intellect monkeyed with physics to make life possible.
All right, we're going to take a little break. My guest is Dr. Stephen Meyer and also Dr. Brad Sickler and Brian DeVries. It's almost like a science fair today. This is great. We're going to take a break and be right back with lots more.
If you'd like to know more about what it means to begin a relationship with Christ or to chat with someone about it, just text the word faith to 41224.
Welcome back to the show. So glad to have as our very special guest today, Dr. Stephen Meyer, being joined in studio with Dr. Brad Sickler and Brian DeVries. Stephen's book is called Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 Scientific Discoveries that Reveal the Mind Behind the Universe. Stephen, you got your PhD in the origin of life biology. Does that sound right?
That was the topic of my thesis. I received the PhD in the philosophy of science.
I did pretty
in Cambridge, good. Yeah.
Okay, I did pretty good in high school biology 101. So I don't know. Do you think you're smarter than me?
I'm certainly not funnier than you. We were talking about that beforehand.
All right.
So.
I'm just enormously intimidated by how smart you guys are, just so you know. But my question is, and then I'll let Brian and Brad ask more questions because I'm running out of my good questions. If there's no designer, how did we get the first living cell?
Well, that's actually a very good question. And
okay.
My first book was called Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. And one of the great discoveries of modern science occurred in the 1950s, first with Watson and Crick elucidating the structure of the DNA molecule, 1953. And then in 1958, Francis Crick, working more on his own, realizing that the chemical subunits that run along the spine of that twisting double helix that we all learn about in high school biology, that those chemical subunits called bases or nucleotide bases are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a section of machine code or software. If you remember from high school biology, you've got the sugar phosphate backbone, the twisting helix, and then on the inside there are chemical subunits called bases or nucleotide bases. And what Crick realized is that those chemical subunits are functioning just like letters in a written text. And they are conveying a message within the cell to direct the construction of proteins and protein machines that are necessary to keep the cell alive. So in modern times today, we have these the technology known as CAD/CAM, computer-assisted design and manufacturing, where at, say, the Boeing plant in Seattle where I live, an engineer will be sitting at his console, write some code. The code will go down a wire. It will be then translated into another machine code, and that code will be used to produce the mechanical systems from the airplane, or for example, it might put the rivets on the airplane wing in just the right places. And so we're using this type of technology all the time in modern manufacturing, and digital code directing the construction of mechanical parts. And this is what Crick and a whole group of other molecular biologists came to realize in the late 50s and 1960s, is that inside living organisms we have a genetic text, we have a genetic code, and we have a whole processing system that uses that genetic information to direct the construction of all the crucial protein molecules that keep cells alive. And that raised a huge question, which is not where is the information? We learned that it was in the DNA molecule. It's not what does the information do? We learned that as well. It produces proteins and protein machines. the big question that was left unanswered was, where did the information come from? And what we know from our uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning, is that whenever we see information, whether it's in a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or a section of software code or the information that we're transmitting over this radio signal, information always arises from an intelligent source. So the discovery of information at the foundation of life is powerful evidence for the activity of a designing intelligence in the origin of life, because we know you can't build a living system without the code. You need the information to build the biological form, the biological entity. And just like in our computer world, if you want to give your computer a new function, you need new code. Well, the same thing is true in life. If you want to build a cell, the first living organism, or if you want to build new forms of life from pre-existing forms of life, you in each case need new information. And yet we know of no other cause of the origin of information, especially if it's in a digital or alphabetic form, than a mind. So what I think we're looking at is evidence of the activity of a designing intelligence in the origin of life.
All right, I'm going to try to think of another smart question, but Brian DeVries, I bet you have something for Stephen.
Yeah, I have a question that I was going to ask him. In the last part of your book, you're talking about the big questions and why they matter. Why is it important to think about things like the origin of the universe, design of living things, and even the existence of God? Why is that important?
Well, in some ways, human destiny is connected to our human origins. Are we the product of undirected material processes? And if so, is it then true that when we die, we decompose, when we die, we rot? This is the materialist credo. When we die, we rot. We are the product of an eternal, self-existent material universe that did not have us in mind. And this has led to a kind of depressing nihilistic worldview that's having a profound effect on young people in particular. The great University of Texas physicist and Nobel laureate Steven Weinberg, who was one of the most outspoken scientific atheists, was quoted as saying, the more the universe seems comprehensible, meaning to our science, the more it seems pointless. There is no meaning or purpose to our existence because there is no personal source of our existence. Meaning is something that is inherently personal. Nothing can mean anything to a rock or to an atom or to a planet or a galaxy. Things only mean things to persons. So if you want to have meaning in your life, there must be, for there to be meaning, there must be persons to whom things mean something. Now, that's fair enough. Some atheists will say, well, we can create our own meaning. But the problem with that is that we only live on this planet for a short period of time. And when we die, according to the materialist philosophy, we rot we cease to exist. And this has been a really troubling insight for many materialists themselves. Bertrand Russell famously was quoted in 1925, the great Cambridge mathematician and atheist, is saying, we have to recognize that no matter how great our human achievements, that eventually they're all going to go away in the heat death of the universe. And there's a very poignant quote that I can't pull from memory about this, but I quote it in Signature in the Cell. And I think a lot of young people sense that. What's the point of my existence? The question I had that haunted me when I was 14 years old was, what's it going to matter in 100 years? I love baseball, and when I started reading about the history of baseball, I had this recurring thought. All the great players had the same trajectory. They were scouted. They came into the major leagues. They acquired records. They retired usually by the time they were 40, and they might have enjoyed the celebrity of their athletic past. But at some point, what was the point of it all? And then I thought, you could be a surgeon. Maybe that would be more important. We could save lives, but eventually those people would die too. And so there's this sense that if there's to be ultimate meaning to human existence, there must be not only a personal source, but a personal destiny. There must be a person behind the universe who has the capacity to grant us life beyond the grave. And this is the message of the Bible and of the Judeo-Christian scriptures, that there is such a personal source for our existence. We are loved and cared for by an omnipotent creator, and there is a possibility of being in an eternal relationship with him and with each other, such that the possibility of personal meaning, which is very real. Apart from that, there is no possibility of ultimate meaning. And the great atheist philosophers, the French existentialists, for example, very much perceived this. Jean-Paul Sartre said, without an infinite and personal reference point, there can be no lasting or enduring meaning. And I think this is the thing that a lot of young people sense. There's a recent article or study coming out of Harvard showing that we have epidemic levels of teen anxiety and anxiety among young people, epidemic levels of depression, and 56% of young people under 30 surveyed said that they had doubts that their own lives had any ultimate meaning or significance. So I think the God question is very much front and center for a lot of people, because if there is a personal and loving creator, as the Judeo-Christian scriptures teach, there is every possibility of ultimate meaning. But if there is not such a person, it's true. When we die, we rot.
Dr. Stephen Meyer is our very special guest. His book is Return of the God Hypothesis. And Stephen, when I found out you were going to be on the show, I sold a 3-question package to Brad Sickler. So it's time, Brad, for you to...
So he's stuck. He's got to play ball with us here.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he couldn't afford the 4-question package, so he bought the 3-question package.
Well,
so
I also thought you were offering to take me to Florida, but
no.
I guess that doesn't work. Yeah, I mean, I love what you were just expounding on, because we've got these different natural theology arguments, and maybe you could touch on just the overall structure and kind of methodology of those. But part of what we do, in addition to like the cosmological argument or the design argument, whether it's rooted in biology or fine-tuning, is sort of defending the rationality or encouraging people about the rationality of Christian belief. But this other issue about meaning and value, that really reaches to the heart of people, you can't generate meaning and moral obligation and moral structure from moving protons, neutrons, and electrons around.
Right.
So, how would you sort of give an overview of the general approach of natural theology arguments, what they're trying to do, what they're not trying to do, sort of some common but maybe misguided complaints against them as a class? How would you overview that?
Right, and there are natural theological arguments that are based on scientific discoveries, and my book marshals those arguments in a contemporary form. I use a mode of reasoning that is used in common by both scientists and philosophers, and by people in ordinary life, detectives and others. It's called inference to the best explanation. So it looks at a data set, and then it says, okay, here's some things we've discovered about the world. Cells contain digital code, for example. Well, what are the possible explanations of that? And then you look at the possible explanations. So you've got something to be explained, and then you look at the possible explanations, and then you evaluate which of those explanations is best based on what we know about the cause and effect structure of the world. If you posit something as producing something else, well, that explanation is credible insofar as we know that something that you're positing as the explanatory entity has the capability of producing the effect in question. So one of Darwin's key mentors was a man named Charles Lyell, a great geologist, and he talked about the idea of causes now in operation. And we want to explain an event in the remote past. We want to posit a cause currently in operation that can produce the effect in question. When I came across this principle in my reading and my research, I asked myself a question, well, what is the cause now in operation that produces digital code? And soon after I posed that question, I came across the work of an early pioneer in the application of the information sciences to biology, and he made an offhand observation. His name was Henry Quastler. He said that the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. I asked myself a question, is that true? And I actually couldn't think of a counterexample to that. Hieroglyphic inscriptions, paragraphs in books, digital code, the things I just mentioned, all of these things come from conscious activity. And so the cause now in operation for the production of digital information is a mind. And therefore, when we find digital information in life, the foundation of living systems, we can infer the activity of a mind as the best explanation for the evidence that we've discovered. And so I use this basic structure, this basic form of reasoning called inference to the best explanation to make biological design arguments and the design argument based on fine-tuning. And then I have other considerations that come to play in developing a cosmological argument. Bill Craig, whose work I very much admire, develops the cosmological argument in a deductive form. Whatever begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe must have a cause. Since causes are separate from their effects, that cause must transcend the physical universe. It must have some other attributes, and the argument is developed that way. The way I like to develop the cosmological argument is complementary to that. I say, well, if the universe had a beginning, which of the major worldviews could best explain that? Well, materialism doesn't explain that, because before the beginning of the material universe itself, before the beginning of matter, space, time, and energy, there was no matter to do the causing. So there's no a possibility of a plausible materialistic explanation for the origin of matter itself. Pantheism as a worldview doesn't do a very good job of explaining that, because the pantheistic creator is seen to be coextensive with the material universe. If the material universe had a beginning, then so did the pantheistic creator. So there is nothing in pantheism, no entity affirmed by pantheism that transcends or is separate from the physical universe. So it can't provide a causal explanation. Instead, you need a creator who is separate or transcendent from the creator. And that means that either theism or deism provides a better explanation for that key fact that has been uncovered by modern cosmology, namely that the universe, as best we can tell, had a beginning. So I use this method of inference to the best explanation to advance both a version of the cosmological argument and two versions of the design argument, one based on fine-tuning and one based on the digital information and complexity of the cell that we've discovered. And I think one advantage of framing arguments this way is that they are necessarily provisional. They're based on scientific evidence that we have. They don't bear an unrealistic burden of proof. We're not trying to prove with absolute certainty that God exists, but nor are we falling into the trap of fideism, saying, well, we just believe because it feels good, or we believe we have faith in faith alone. So there's, I think, a middle way in apologetics where you provide you provide evidence and reasons in support of belief in God as a best explanation, but don't try to bear the unreasonable burden of proof of giving absolute certainty.
All right, we'll take a little break and be right back with Dr. Stephen Meyer. His book is Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 Scientific Discoveries That Reveal the Mind Behind the Universe. We're also joined with Dr. Brad Sickler and Brian DeVries. We'll be right back.
It's the afternoon show with Bill Arnold. Prime time, drive time. Let's get it started. Jump in your car. Yeah. What's for dinner? Hey. It's the afternoon show with Bill Arnold.
Welcome back to the show. So glad to have Dr. Stephen Meyer as our very special guest today. Also joined by Dr. Brad Sickler, who's the department head of Biblical and Theological Studies and professor of philosophy here at the University of Northwestern, and Brian DeVries, who's an area director for Search Ministries, Minnesota. Let me ask you, Stephen, about Darwin's theory of evolution. Is it based on laboratory science?
Well, it's based on observations from natural history and some laboratory experiments as well. You may be asking me to explain why I'm skeptical of it.
That's okay.
Yeah, implied. Yeah, okay. So the idea of evolution has multiple meanings. It can mean simply change over time, small-scale variation that's observable, such as Darwin's finches getting bigger and smaller beak sizes in response to varying weather patterns. Nobody doubts that level, that small-scale, sometimes called microevolution. But the term evolution can also mean the idea that all organisms are descended from a single common ancestor. That's the idea of universal common descent. That's a second meaning of evolution, about which I happen to be skeptical. Third meaning of evolution is even more contentious, and that's the idea that an unguided, undirected process, natural selection acting on random mutations, is responsible for the appearance of design and the complexity that we observe in living organisms. And that's the aspect of Darwinian evolution that proponents of intelligent design agree needs to be challenged. So that's where we don't accept the idea of mere the appearance of design, as the Darwinists affirm it, but rather we say there's evidence of real design. And I wrote a book called Darwin's Doubt The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. And there I showed that not only does Darwinian evolution have a problem explaining the patterns we see in the fossil record, where the major innovations in the history of life, the abrupt appearance of new biological form with, for example, an event called the Cambrian explosion and many other such events where you have big bursts of new biological form entering the fossil record with no evidence in the lower strata of ancestral intermediate forms that would connect these new forms to even yet earlier, simpler forms, as you'd expect to see in a Darwinian view. That's a big problem. This is one of the problems I addressed. I called it the problem of the missing fossils. But an even deeper problem is the problem of how the Darwinian mechanism would build all these new forms of life. Because as I mentioned before, just as in our computer world, you need new information to build. If you want to give your computer a new function, you have to have new information. If you want to build a new form of life, you've got to have new information. And yet, the Darwinian mechanism affirms that random changes in the genetic text, called mutations, are the source of that new information. But we know from our computer world that if you start randomly changing zeros and ones in a section of computer code, you're going to degrade that code and cause the computer to lose function long before you're going to generate a new program or operating system. And so as people have begun to think about, computer scientists, physicists, mathematically inclined scientists have begun to think about the odds of generating a new section of genetic text called a gene capable of building a new protein or a new biological structure by random mutation, they've realized that the Darwinian mechanism is actually mathematically extremely implausible. And I go through the math of that in my book, but if you can just think about what happens when you mutate or change computer code randomly, you don't build something new, you degrade what you have. And that same problem applies to Darwinian evolution. In other words, the Darwinian model does not account for the origin of the new information you need to build new biological structures.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, Brian bought the two-question package. So, Brian, you're telling me the last.
Let's get him back in here. Yeah,
I was going to get the position on record for the old Earth, young Earth discussion. Where do you sit, and how do you get there?
Well, right. As a representative of a network of scientists who are advancing the theory of intelligent design, I am officially age neutral. The theory of intelligent design is not addressing the question of how long the days of Genesis were, which is, I know, a contentious issue within the Christian religious community. I have a view on that myself, but the important thing is that intelligent design is addressing a different question. Is the appearance of design in living organisms that nearly all biologists recognize real or illusory? Again, that Dawkins quote. Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. The Darwinian view is that the appearance of design is an illusion because there's an unguided, undirected process called natural selection acting on random mutations that can produce that appearance. We dispute that. We think that the mutation selection mechanism, natural selection mechanism, has very limited creative power, and it certainly does not have the power to generate the new information necessary to build fundamentally new forms of life, such as the new animals that appear abruptly in events like the Cambrian explosion. Having said that, my own view, so we have tried to build a kind of a big tent among the Christians in our movement and say, look, the age question is secondary. Let's not fight over that. While we've been fighting over that, we've given these Darwinian rascals a free pass on what is essentially a very weak argument that they have. So this key question of design has been obscured by all this internecine fighting over how to interpret words like yom in the Bible. And so now my own view on it is that I have the view that the Earth is very old, the universe is very old, and that but anatomically modern man, our species, is fairly recent. And I could go into the empirical reasons for that, but I think also biblically, I'm not convinced that the Bible teaches a young Earth, which many Christians think, and my reason for that is I have several reasons for that, but one of the outstanding biblical reasons for that is the account of the creation in the day 4 account of creation in Genesis 1. There, the Bible teaches that the that God either created from nothing or caused to appear, depending on how you render a Hebrew word hayah, the sun and the moon and the stars, and he gave them as markers of the days, the years, and the seasons. Well, we mark time today as the result by watching the sun move across the ecliptic. So the sun is a time marker for us. The moon is a time marker. It marks months. And so it's very hard to say that the days of creation, which have already been established, we've already had 3 days of creation, the yoms of creation have already been established, but they were established before there are time markers. So it's hard to know how long those days of creation were before we had a way of marking them or denominating them in the way we mark time today. So I think we have to be very careful to avoid imputing our notions of time to the biblical text. And so I think those days of creation are probably of indeterminate length, and therefore I feel comfortable looking to the science to define the questions about the chronology of the universe.
All right, we'll take a little break. Dr. Stephen Meyer is our special guest today. His book, Return of the God Hypothesis, and also joined in studio by Dr. Brad Sickler and Brian DeVries. We'll take a short break and be right back. Faith Radio and Afternoons with Bill podcasts are available because of listener support. If you are a supporter, thank you so much. Becoming a supporter today by visiting myfaithradio.com. Welcome back to the show. My guest is Dr. Stephen Meyer, also joined by Brad Sickler and Brian DeVries. Because, Brad, there's no refunds and you bought the 3-question packet, I want to clear some space for you, so I don't want you mad at me.
Well, in thinking about these issues, some of the defensive stuff that we're doing to try to defend the rationality of theistic belief in general, or Christian belief in particular, getting back to this pushing back and trying to show some of the irrationality of materialism or just straight naturalism. Darwin himself had an observation, and I'd like you to comment on it, and he says this: "With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which had been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind?"
It's the other doubt that Darwin had about his
horrid doubt.
His horrid doubt. He had a doubt about the adequacy of his theory to explain the Cambrian fossils. And I wrote a whole book about this called Darwin's Doubt. But there's a second doubt that he expressed, and it's the one that you just shared. And that is his doubt about the reliability of the human mind if his theory were true. If we arose by strictly mindless, undirected material processes, then not only our bodies but our mental capabilities are also the product of those irrational processes. And that raises a question on what basis do we trust the reliability of our minds. In Darwinism, everything is optimized for survival, but there are many beliefs that we have, scientific beliefs, that have really nothing to do with our ability to survive. Everything we know about the cosmos, everything we supposedly know about evolutionary theory has very little bearing on our survival. So there's this potentially self-contradictory aspect to Darwinian materialism. If you think of the mind as the product of undirected material processes, of mindless processes, on what basis would you accept its deliverances? On the other hand, if you start with a theistic premise, or if you have good reasons to think that theism is true, then there is a good reason to trust the reliability of the mind. And this was actually a really important premise of the scientific revolution. The early scientists during the period of the scientific revolution, from around 1500 to 1700, say, believed that they had a key principle, a guiding principle, and that was they called it they believed in the intelligibility of the universe, that it could be understood by the human mind. Why? Because they believed that our minds had been made in the image of a rational creator who had built into the universe principles of rationality and order and design. So the universe had been designed in an orderly way that we could understand because our minds had been made in the image of the Creator who had made the universe in a rational and orderly way. And so there was a principle of correspondence between what the Cambridge physicist John Polkinghorne used to call the reason within our own minds and the reason built into the creation, the reason without. And so this worry about the reliability of the mind doesn't really arise in theism, because if our minds are the product of a benevolent creator who wants us to know the creation that he made, then we have reason to trust that our cognitive equipment is generally reliable in knowing the world around us. But if instead our minds are only are the product of undirected, mindless processes, we don't really have any reason to trust them. John Lennox has a story he tells about talking to people at high table in one of the Oxford colleges, and he says, well, if you learned that the computer programs you are using were the product of random processes with no programmer behind them, would you trust their outputs? And his interlocutors say, well, no, of course not. He said, well, then why would you trust the reliability of the mind if it were the product of mindless processes, random mutations and the like? And at least in the way that John tells the story, it was a stumper of a question. I think it's a very good question.
So in thinking about Bill, can I give you an IOU for a fourth question?
You're going to owe me, but go ahead.
He'll send the money later.
Yeah, I'll owe you. So in Scripture, for example, Colossians 1 and Hebrews 1, we hear about God upholding all things by the power of his word, and it's by Christ and through and for Christ that all things
are held together,
right, and that they were created. So how do you see a proper understanding of divine causation and God's ongoing activity in sustaining the universe, not just having created in the past? How do you see that informing some of your perspective?
That's a great thing. I was just going to quickly mention that I addressed this, what's called the epistemological argument or the argument from epistemological necessity, in the very last chapter of Return of the God hypothesis. So most of the book is about evidential arguments, design arguments, cosmological arguments, and their defense. But in the end, I talk quite a bit about my own reflection on this need for a creator as the grounding of of our belief in the reliability of the mind. But also I discuss Alvin Plantinga's amazing work in his 3-volume set, Warrant and Proper Function, where Plantinga develops this argument against, he shows that the conjunction of evolutionary theory with the worldview of naturalism ends up producing a perspective that it ends up generating a self-defeating view of the reliability of the mind.
That's where the conflict really lies.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, it's where a conflict lies. Yeah. I think there are more conflicts than that. But your question, sorry, was...
it's just about, God's sustaining work and how that fits into your picture.
I think there was a great medieval distinction between the potentia ordinata, the ordinary power of God, in upholding the regular concourse of nature, which we describe with our concept of the laws of nature, and also the potentia absoluta, or the fiat power of God's ability to act as an agent discreetly within the orderly concourse of nature that he otherwise sustains and upholds. So the medieval theologians affirm two powers of God, that he is responsible for the orderly concourse of nature that we observe and describe as the lawful order, we describe with our notion of the laws of nature, but he can also act discreetly in individual cases in what we would term as miracles, that there are instances of singular actions of the divine person that are also part of how he interacts with nature, so that there's really two powers. I personally don't think, for many philosophical reasons, that what we call miracles violate the laws of nature. Rather, I think that they are instances of God acting as an agent within an orderly system that he's responsible for. If I'm about to knock two billiard balls together on a pool table, and I'm in a position to predict exactly where one ball will go if I hit it with another ball in a very precise way, but then somebody shakes the table, I will no longer be able to predict where the ball is going to go. But it doesn't mean that the law of momentum exchange was violated. It means that an agent interfered with that orderly system to cause a different outcome. And I think of a miracle in the same way as God's agent causation, or his agent action, as the Bible says with the Exodus account, and the Lord caused an east wind to blow. He can act within the natural order without violating the laws of nature.
Stephen, thank you so much for doing the show today. I know you've had a long day, and I so appreciate you being willing to come on and spend a whole hour with us. And Brad Sickler, thank you. And Brian DeVries, thank you as well.
You bet.
Yeah,
to
thank
be
you,
here.
and for all these awesome questions.
Oh, thank you so much. We're going to take a little break. When we come back, Dr. Michael Wise is going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Thanks for listening. Programming like this is made available through your support. Information available at myfaithradio.com.